Back in the day, when governments wanted hospitals or subway lines or train stations built, they hired a company to build that infrastructure, then oversaw the project themselves. But in recent years, complaints about billions in cost overruns and poor management have prompted governments to try alternative means of getting these mega projects done. And so, public-private partnerships, or P3s, are now what typically happens. Here to review the pluses and minuses of the P3 process, Lou Serafini Jr., President and Chief Executive Officer of Fengate Asset Management. Nice to have you here and in that chair.
Thank you.
Just put a bit more meat on the bone that I described in the intro here. Governments have typically got out of the business of overseeing these big infrastructure projects. Why?
Well, the main reason is there was a poor track record historically of meeting project budgets, delivering them on time. And the other part of it is trying how to deliver it better by creating centers of excellence around the country so that these projects could meet a scope of work that was delivered on time and on budget.
Give us some examples here in the province of Ontario of something that would have been built by the P3 process and maybe we didn't even know it.
Sure. So hospitals, there was a program in the mid-2000s, probably 2006 to 2010, where the average age of a hospital in Ontario was about 43 years old. The government created a center of excellence through Infrastructure Ontario with the intent of finding the lessons learned so that we can deliver these projects on time and on budget. Historically, what was happening is these decisions would fall to a local authority. And the local authority would have never built a hospital. They would have been, as I said, their hospital would have been over 40 years old. And most times budgets weren't met because the scope of services wasn't defined, or the design elements of the building didn't allow for a long life cycle, if you will, for these buildings to last the 50 years that they were.
So these are, I mean, we're talking billion-dollar projects here, right?
Billion-dollar projects.
Billion-dollar projects. Yeah. Okay, what's your role in these things?
So in public-private partnerships, there's this nomenclature that the private sector is taking over the project, and it's not that at all. There's always been private sector involvement, even when the government procures these projects. Government doesn't own architectural firms or engineering firms. They don't own construction companies. What's really, in my mind, helped this become a really leading class way of delivering public infrastructure in Ontario is the idea of private sector finance. And my role is to play that, to develop the debt solution and provide the equity that supports the debt solution. So if you were to think of a stool with three legs, in Ontario, there would be the construction element, the services element, and then the finance element. And that's where Fengate plays a role. That's where
Fengate plays a role. So when somebody says, I need a new hospital built, you're the guy who goes out and sort of partners up with a construction company, finds all the sources of revenue to make it happen, that kind of thing?
So in Ontario, the model is a little bit different. There are two types of infrastructure that are being delivered. One would be availability-based, and one would be subject to revenue risk. So in Ontario, if it is a hospital or an accommodation building, a courthouse or an administration building, what would happen is the government would come out with a scope of what they require, and they would be looking to pay a fixed payment on a monthly basis for a contract term. During that contract term, the consortium develops pricing for this scope, and then so long as the facility is made available to the government repatriates this monthly payment to the consortium.
Okay, can we do a real-life example here?
Sure.
I'm the province of Ontario.
Right.
I call you up one day, I say, Lou, I want to redevelop Ontario Place. Okay, I want you to bring it back to life. It's been kind of left fallow for far too many years, and we want you to bid on having the right to spruce it up and do something with it. Go. What do you do?
Well, it's a more complicated question when it comes to Ontario Place as opposed to a hospital. But in Ontario Place, now it's about creating innovation and creativity. What do we know now? We know that it's basically a shell of its former self. We know that the government is spending money to maintain what is there. So the idea is, what is it we're trying to achieve here? Are we trying to create a world-class destination? Are we trying to create a new neighborhood where there'll be residential and office and mixed uses? So once that scope is defined, our job is to find the right partners who can answer to this request for proposals in the best way possible to try to get to win that deal. And that deal there would depend on mostly what revenue is available to pay the bills.
Okay, to that end, I have a few more ideas for you, Lou.
Sure.
Actually, I don't have the ideas. The Minister of Tourism, Culture and Recreation had the ideas. Here's what he had to say about all this. Sheldon, if you would.
I want to be clear. Our vision for Ontario Place does not include residential developments or casinos.
Okay, so I come back to you and I say, Lou, again, I want you to bid on this thing, but no casinos, no condos. What do you do now? Well,
like all public infrastructure, you need money to pay the bills. So we're going to make a capital investment. That capital investment has to be, repaid. And typically you have to make a return for the risks that you're taking. So condos or development entitlements are a good way to generate new revenues.
As would casinos be.
As would casinos be. In Ontario Place, if the intent of government is to create a destination for families and there are no entitlements available in the residential sector, there are no lease payments available from a casino operation, then the assessment has to happen what will drive traffic and what will drive revenue at that site so that we can recover our investment.
Okay, let's keep playing what if here. If I say to you, no casinos, no housing there, Lou, in real life, do you push back on me and say, well, look, if you're not going to allow me to put a casino or condos there, there's no business model for me to make it work, so forget it, I'm out.
And that's likely what will happen if it doesn't make sense for the private sector. So the whole idea of private sector involvement is to create more discipline for the process so that there can be a true assessment made of whether the project is viable. If that project is unfinanceable, it's very likely that they will attract a bid that makes the project a reality.
Can you think, just blue skying here, if no casinos and no housing, what could bring lots of people down there that would make it a reasonable investment for the private sector and also be a good tourist destination as well?
So, I mean, you said it, a tourist destination is based on many elements. It could be food and beverage, it could be programming for youth, it could be programming for kids, an entertainment venue, if you will. And there are good examples all around the world where this happens. In Toronto and in Canada in particular, very rarely do you see programming that goes 12 months of the year. And the reality is if we were to embrace our roots and our weather, you know, there is a possibility to create year-round destination at Ontario Place. There is a good example in the stage and the music venues, very popular. But there's some fundamental flaws with that site that would prevent a consortium of taking undue risk. So for instance, transportation is weak in that area. If you have to take your car there, it's difficult to park there. It's just not convenient.
Let's say, again, you've come in, you've got this hospital built, whatever, you've got this new library built, you've got this new bridge built, whatever it is. After it's all said and done, who owns it?
The government always owns it. There is a misconception that the private sector owns it. We hear many times that the 407 is a bad example of a public-private partnership. It was not a public-private partnership. It was a true privatization, at least phase one was. And where we come in is we come in and deliver a service. And the service is the design of this building and incorporating that design with the long-term service of this facility. So we will meet a scope. We will meet a minimum scope that says that the government can pay us on a monthly basis. So when that happens, you tend to get a lot more integration in upfront design. So we're investing more at the beginning so that we're spending less at the end. And today's dollars are cheaper than dollars from 20 years from now.
Once the hospital is done, it's up, it's built, patients are coming in, services are being provided. Do you have an ongoing role with the facility?
Yeah, we do. We oversee the service provider. What's really important to know is how this financial mechanism works. When the government turns over this project and it's delivered, all of a sudden these rules kick into place. So if we're late or if we have cost overruns, we're responsible for those. So if we misestimated on our budget, we're paying that bill. If we're late, we're paying the liquidated damages. Those penalties can be hundreds of thousands of dollars to make up for lost revenue. And when you go through the service element of these contracts, which typically run longer than 25 years, if we're not meeting our scope of service, if something that we designed and are responsible for is not working, we're responsible for fixing it.
How often do these P3s go over budget or go past due date?
Well, the track record is that it happens less often when it's under a P3 procurement model. There have been examples, though, where they've gone over budget, but a very difficult thing for a contractor to walk away if that's their business in terms of not delivering. If they want a future of doing construction projects in Canada, they have to step up and put their name on it.
Well, here's one of the criticisms I hear, which is that if I'm just going to do this myself as the government of Ontario, I can borrow money at a much better rate than, for example, you could when you're putting your consortium together, and therefore it's going to be cheaper if I just do it as opposed to have you do it. Is that true?
This is true. The government can borrow more cheaply than the private sector. But it's the discipline of the private sector financing that raises the bar, if you will. What the government has been doing is been making substantial completion payments or milestone payments. Their balance sheet can borrow much more cheaply than us, so you are still getting an element of risk transfer. And what does the premium that you're paying in private sector, what value does that create? That is really the issue at stake. So if our private sector is paying more in debt costs, how does that translate to value? Well, there's a variety of ways. One is if the project does go wrong, and there have been examples where projects have gone wrong, what is it that the lenders do? The lenders require equity to backstop that. We had the case at CAMH where the service provider went into receivership, a global company, large, from the UK, and when the service provider was replaced, that cost was more expensive. Well, that is the burden of equity, the concessionaire, if you will. If that was a government project, procured simply by them, they would be the ones bearing that increased cost by replacing the service provider.
So the taxpayers would have to eat the extra.
The taxpayers would pay that.
But in this case,
the investors do.
They do.
That's correct.
And do they really ever take a haircut on these things?
Yes, absolutely.
So they can't just go back to government and say, hey, look, something happened here, we didn't plan on it, and can you help us out by topping us up a bit?
They can always ask, but does it always happen? I mean, sometimes it does get down to negotiation. There have been many examples, though, in Canada and the US where projects have not gone the way they were intended to, and there are costs to bear.
Any projects you can think of where doing a P3 would not be appropriate?
Yes, there are many. It's not for every project. Many projects at the municipal level wouldn't benefit from the increased costs of finance, legal, with respect to delivering a solution. And municipal projects that are standardized in scope, arenas and smaller accommodation buildings, for instance, some type of road work where the scope is simple and there is a very good track record of delivering, those are projects that don't make sense for the public-private partnership model.
I'm trying to also think of other reasons why the government might want to do it this way, and I guess is one of them that the expenditures, the billions of dollars it costs to get these things done, they don't actually show up on the books of the government in that year. And that helps them at budget time, presumably, if they want to show that they're getting closer to balance or whatever.
Well, the government is still responsible for the debt because they're responsible for a concession payment to the consortium. The reality is when you're looking at complicated projects, if we were to bury the Gardner and create a tunnel, this is complicated work. And if this is work that you would need to attract world-class players to come to this market to have a competitive process in delivering this infrastructure. So that would be a really good area where private sector involvement would help. Other areas when you start to look at expertise, there's certain expertise of bridge work that have been done around the world that may be limited in Canada. So here's another way where we would bring in the private sector to help with innovation and creativity in delivering public infrastructure.
Have you got any projects on the go right now?
We have several.
Anything we'd have heard of here in Ontario?
We just closed on En Route, which is an infrastructure project, and that's the service centers along the 400 series highways. And
all of them?
All of them.
You got all of them?
Yeah, with our partners. And that one there is interesting. We modeled out on how we see traffic flowing and how many people stop and how much do they spend when they go in there. And it's a good investment for our investors. And at the end of the day, it's hard to find good investments in Canada of that quality.
Let's finish up on this then. Any other potential projects out there that you think could be or need to be done that would be, if it's not mid-market, what do you call it? Up-market?
Yeah, so I mean, large infrastructure projects could be like tens, 20s billion, you know, buying the utility of a country, for instance. We participate mostly in the Canadian space and in the US space, projects that are a couple billion and smaller. That would be considered mid-market in our world. And I think we need to take a really hard view on how we deliver transportation projects. I see it that we're building these LRTs. We need an expanded regional system. We were really pleased to see the uploading of TTC to the province. You know, Toronto needs to connect to the communities around it. And what I noticed, and I think is a missed opportunity, is that these systems are creating real estate values. And the ones that are doing well are the people selling the real estate. And yet it is the taxpayer creating all this value by putting in transportation.
Gotcha. That's Lou Serafini Jr., President and CEO, Fengate Asset Management. I think we know a lot more about P3s now than we did 20 minutes ago. So thanks for this, Lou.
Thank you for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.